Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we will have a discussion on the theme comparative method. This we will discuss within the framework of comparative politics. The broad objectives of this lecture are: number 1, to understand what is a method; number 2, to highlight the need for comparative method and develop understanding of comparative method; number 3, to analyze various limitations and strengths of comparative method. So, dear students, let us start with a brief discussion on what is method. In the sphere of social sciences, method and approach are used interchangeably. However, method is a more general term which refers to a particular way of doing something. In a systematic study, method may be defined as the procedure of inquiry by which reliable knowledge could be obtained and reliable conclusions drawn. Examples of method used by scholars for their studies are scientific method, inductive method, deductive method, comparative method, statistical method, and so on. An approach, on the other hand, is a wider term which comprehends not only the method, that is how to inquire, but also the focus of our study, that is what to inquire in order to understand the given phenomenon. To put it briefly, approaches consist of criteria for selecting problem and relevant data, whereas methods are procedures for getting and utilizing data. It may be pointed out that various methods may use comparisons to varying degrees, because comparative method is not the monopoly of the comparative politics alone. It is used in all domains of knowledge to study physical, human, and social phenomena. Sociology, history, anthropology, psychology, literature, and so on use it with similar confidence. These disciplines have used the comparative method to produce studies which are referred variously as cross-cultural, say in case of anthropology and psychology, and cross-national in case of political science and sociology, seeming thereby to emphasize different fields. Now, dear students, we need to understand what comparative method does and why do we need to compare. The comparative method helps us to study the similarities and differences as the basis for developing a what is called as a grounded theory, then testing hypotheses and producing reliable generalizations. Social scientists believe that research should be scientifically organized. The comparative method, they believe, offers them the best means to conduct scientific research, that is, a research characterized by precision, validity, reliability, and verifiability, as well as some amount of predictability. The American political scientist James Coleman, for example, often reminded his students that, I quote, "You cannot be scientific if you are not comparing," unquote. Guy Swanson similarly emphasized that it was unthinkable to think of scientific thought and all scientific research without comparisons. Whereas in physical sciences, comparisons can be done in laboratories under carefully controlled conditions. However, such precise experimentation is not possible in social sciences. If, for example, a social scientist wishes to study the relationship between electoral systems and the number of political parties, he cannot instruct a government to change electoral system nor order people to behave in a particular way to test the hypothesis. Nor can the researcher replicate a social or political phenomena in a laboratory where tests can be conducted. Thus, while a social scientist may feel compelled to work in a scientific way, societal phenomenon may not actually permit what is accepted as scientific inquiry. But dear students, a social scientist can however study cases, that is actually existing political systems, and compare them, that is chalk out a way to study their relationship as worked out in the hypotheses, then draw conclusions and offer generalizations. Thus, the comparative method, though scientifically weaker than the experimental method, is considered closest to a scientific method, offering the best possible opportunity to seek explanations of societal phenomena and offer theoretical propositions and generalizations. The question one might ask now is, what makes comparative method scientific? Italian political scientist Sartori argued that control function, or the system of checks, which is integral to the scientific research and a necessary part of laboratory experimentation, can be achieved in social sciences only through comparisons. He goes further to propose that because the control function can be exercised only through comparative method, comparisons are indispensable in social sciences. Because of their function of controlling, checking the validity of theoretical propositions, comparisons have the scientific value of making generalized propositions or theoretical statements explaining particular phenomena, making predictions, and also what Sartori terms learning from others' experiences. Now, dear students, let us see how comparative method is defined by scholars. There is no general agreement among scholars on comparative method, its nature or its scope. While some of them, like Samuel and Eisenstein, argued that the term does not properly designate a specific method, but rather a special focus on cross-societal, institutional, or macro-societal aspects of societies and social analysis, others, like Arndt Lechford, holds that it can be defined as one of the basic methods, the others being experimental, statistical, and case study methods of establishing general propositions. On the other hand, Harold Laswell argues that for anyone with a scientific approach to political phenomena, the idea of an independent comparative method seems redundant. Besides, the scientific approach is unavoidably comparative. Gabriel Almond also equates the comparative with the scientific method. Yet, it is essential to underline that scholars do recognize that comparative method is a method of discovering empirical relationships among variables and not a method of measurement. The step of measuring variables is logically prior to the step of finding relationships among them. It is the second of these steps to which the term comparative method refers. The comparative method is a comprehensive general method, not a narrow specialized technique. It is in this vein that scholars refer to the method of comparison, or some prefer the term comparative approach because it lacks the preciseness to call it a technique. The comparative method may also be thought of as a basic research strategy in contrast with a mere technical aid to research. The comparative method is best understood if briefly compared with the experimental, statistical, and case study methods. The experimental method is used to understand the relationship between two variables in a controlled situation. Since such experiments are not possible in political science, an alternative is the statistical method, which helps you to analyze the quantitative data in order to discover controlled relationships among variables. It handles the problem of control by means of partial correlations, that is, by dividing the sample into a number of different groups, for example, on the basis of age, income, education, and so on, and looking at the correlation between the two selected variables in each. This has come to be accepted as a standard procedure and is applied almost automatically in empirical research. Thus, the statistical method is an approximation of experimental method as it uses the same logic. Therefore, comparative method essentially resembles the statistical method, except that the number of cases it deals with is often too small to permit statistical methods. At the same time, it is necessary to understand that comparative method is not an adequate substitute for the experimental method as in the natural sciences, but these weaknesses can be minimized in a number of ways. The statistical method is best to use as far as possible, except in cases where entire political systems are being compared. In such cases, the comparative method has to be used. The two can also be used in combination. Here, the comparative analysis will be the first stage in which macro hypotheses are carefully formulated, usually covering the structural elements of the system, and the statistical stage in which these are tested has a sample as large as possible. Second, too much significance must not be attached to the negative findings, like rejecting a hypothesis on the basis of one deviant case, especially when the sample is small. Thirdly, it is necessary to increase the number of cases as much as possible. Comparative politics has advanced because of the formulation of universally applicable theories based on comparison of many countries or political phenomena within them. For example, structural functional analysis theory opened up a world of comparative research unknown before. Fourth, increase the number of variables if not the number of cases. Through this, more generalizations are possible. Fifth, focus on comparable cases, that is, those that have a large number of comparable characteristics which one can treat as constants, but at the same time dissimilar as far as those variables which one wants to relate to each other. Here, the area or regional approach is useful. For example, comparing countries within Latin America or Scandinavia or Asia. Another alternative is studying regions within countries or studying them at different points of time, as the problem of control is much simpler since they are within the same federal structure. For example, states within the Indian Union provide a rich laboratory for comparative research. Finally, many scholars feel that focus should be on the contextual variables, as too many variables can create problems. This has been used successfully in anthropological studies, and political scientists can also do this by limiting the number of variables. Further, it may be mentioned that the case study method is used whenever only one case is being analyzed, but it is closely connected with the comparative method, and certain types of case studies can become an inherent part of the comparative method whenever an in-depth study of a variable is needed prior to the comparison with other similar ones. Though the scientific status of the case study method is somewhat ambiguous, however, its value lies in it being used as a building block for making general propositions and even theory building in political science when a number of case studies on similar subjects are carried out. And dear students, at the same time, it is important to remember that comparative and case study methods are not absolutely perfect, and because of the inevitable limitations of these methods, it is a challenging task of the investigator in the field of comparative politics to apply these methods in such a way as to capitalize on their inherent strengths in order to make them useful instruments in scientific political inquiry. In the post-war period, many scholars have spent much of the time in constantly trying to improve the use of these methods. Now, dear students, let us look at the brief history of the comparative social research. Dear students, comparative social research has a long history. Herodotus was one of the first to use systematic observation across societies as a basis for generalizing about human behavior. Many of the topics he considered in his 9 books of history would today be classified as anthropology, political science, or sociology. At one point, he made a comparative study between Egyptians and the Lacedaemonians with respect to interaction between young men and their elders. Based on his study, he argued that in both societies, when they meet on the street, the young men gave way to their elders by stepping aside, and when the elders came in the room, the young men rose from their seats. In the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides made a number of cross-societal comparisons. He pointed out that Sparta controlled its allies by establishing oligarchies to rule them. In contrast, Athens tended to focus on exacting tribute from its allies. Aristotle collected and analyzed data on 158 political constitutions. His concern with cross-societal similarities and differences in governments, and particularly in constitutions, is extensively documented in his work Politics. The comparative method as prescribed today may be traced more directly to the works of Herbert Spencer and other 19th century evolutionists. The proponents of evolutionary theory viewed society as passing through a series of stages. Evidence from existing primitive societies could be used to make inferences about what more advanced societies were like at the earlier stage in their evolution. Similarly, Karl Marx also drew heavily on comparative historical data. One example is his discussion on various epochs characterized by difference in the modes of production, ranging from primitive communism to ancient society based on slavery, to feudal society based on serfdom, and finally to modern capitalism based on wage labor. Following World War I, there appeared much criticism of the evolutionist perspective and consequently a movement away from cross-cultural analysis. The revival of the method is due in part to the works of George Murdoch, who was interested in the relationship between kinship structure and other aspects of culture. He based his analysis on a sample of 230 predominantly primitive societies drawn from around the world. Improvements in transportation and communication, as well as the more assertive role of United States in the world affairs after 1945 produced a new generation of comparativists, not only in anthropology but also in sociology, political science and psychology. Some of these researchers analyzed the industrial democracies of Western Europe and North America. Others concentrated on centrally planned economies of the communist bloc. Beginning in the early 1960s, the developing and the newly independent countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America became a third major focus of comparative investigation. As a result of the renewed interest in comparative research, the number of such studies has continued to increase since the 1960s. Major journals in sociology and political science regularly include qualitative and quantitative cross-national research. There has been a surge in historical comparative work and in case studies of important social events. Books and articles focus on population, social stratification, growth of state structures, criminology, education, electoral system, and many other topics. One very important factor in the growing emphasis on the quantitative comparative research has been the explosion in data available for such work. Organizations such as United Nations, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and many other organizations and institutions produce volumes of data concerning the social, political, and economic affairs of nations, and this data is often readily available to the researchers. Also, international projects such as the World Value Survey, Worldwide Governance Indicators, and so on have distributed high quality data to comparative researchers. Finally, dear students, it is also imperative to briefly highlight the weakness and strengths of comparative method. Although comparative method in political science is considered to be advantageous in linking theory to evidence and enhancing it as a scientific discipline, however, there are certain constraints as well that limit its possibilities and can impair its usefulness. First, let us discuss its strengths. Dear students, comparative method can be applied to compare political systems of different countries, and also it can be used to compare political systems over time. It has been documented that the main advantage of comparative method is that it makes the study of politics more structured, and conclusions derived with this method are more precise. One of the most noteworthy strengths of the comparative method is that it can be used to test the generalizability of a finding that is based on data from one society. It is not at all uncommon for propositions to be stated as if they apply to all societies, but such propositions have often not been actually tested cross-societally. The comparative method also allows us to test theories that specify as variables macro level structures or behaviors, that is, characteristics of entire societies. If a theory states that the political or economic structure of a country has a causal impact on the way in which income and wealth are distributed, we encounter problems in attempting to verify this proposition on the basis of data from that one country alone. It is not possible to assess the impact of a variable such as economic structure, which is constant for any one nation. However, if we compare income inequality in several societies with different types of economies, we will be in a position to draw some conclusions about the impact of economic structure on the distribution of wealth. In general, it is not possible to obtain a qualitative estimate of the effect of any society-wide characteristic on the basis of data from just one country. However, if we base our study on several societies and select them in such a way that there is variation in the macro level characteristic of the variable that interests us, it is possible to estimate the effect of this variable. However, despite these benefits, there are certain difficulties and drawbacks in comparative method as well. Common problem of politics is that there are usually too many variables and too few cases. There are more than 200 countries in the world, but they are all quite different. It is impossible to compare drastically different or completely identical countries. So, in order to take advantage of comparative method, only similar countries with minor differences should be compared. But often it may prove difficult to find such comparable cases. It may be noted that common classification of scientific methods by Arndt Lichford is comprehensible only to a limited extent and is in part ambiguous. He distinguishes between experimental and non-experimental methods. Among the non-experimental methods which are applied in comparative politics in particular, he differentiates between statistical and comparative method as well as the case study. The difference between the statistical and comparative method is challenging. Particularly, describing the statistical method as an independent procedure is a bit problematic. The other problem raised by researchers with regard to the comparative method is that research might not be objective and that researcher purposely chooses countries to demonstrate negative or positive moments as proof for his or her opinion. For example, consider a proposition that countries with weak trade unions are more economically effective than countries with strong trade unions. Here, the trade unionists and on the opposite side, managing directors have a political point to make. So, more than likely, their conclusions might completely diverge. The other is the micro replications designed to test out in other national and cultural settings a proposition already validated in one setting. Here too one can use the comparative method, but if the proposition in question focuses on individuals as units of analysis, one can also use the statistical method. As Merritt and Rocken point out, instead of one nation one case approach, nationality can simply be treated as additional variable on par with other individual attributes such as occupation, age, sex, type of neighborhood, and so on. Terence K. Hopkins and Emanuel Wallerstein make a similar distinction between truly cross-national studies in which total systems are the unit of analysis and multinational but cross-individual research. The second general comment concerns a dangerous but tempting fallacy in the application of comparative method, the fallacy of attaching too much significance to negative findings. Dear students, comparative method should not lapse into what Johann Galtung calls the traditional quotation, where cases are picked that are in accordance with the hypothesis and hypotheses are rejected if one deviant case is found. All cases should of course be selected systematically, and the scientific research should be aimed at probabilistic and not universal generalizations. The erroneous tendency to reject a hypothesis on the basis of a single deviant case is rare when the statistical method is used to analyze a large sample, but in the comparative analysis of a smaller number of cases, even a single deviant finding tends to loom large. One or two deviant cases obviously constitute a much less serious problem in a statistical analysis of too many cases than in a comparative study of only few cases, perhaps less than 10 cases. But it is nevertheless a mistake to reject a hypothesis because one can think pretty quickly of a contrary case. Deviant cases weaken a probabilistic hypothesis, but they can only invalidate it if they turn up in significant numbers to make the hypothesized relationship disappear altogether. So, dear students, to conclude, comparison is a basic human endeavor. Consciously or unconsciously, we keep on comparing many things around us. In the discipline of political science, using comparative method, one can not only explain general descriptions or characteristics of the institutions, systems, or phenomena, but also provide a nuanced understanding of the political system, the patterns, similarities, and differences. Comparative method is certainly an effective method to study and analyze comparative politics, but researchers must be aware of the problems related with this process. Comparative method is used as a basis in all methods of valuation. Comparative method makes the understanding of a complex political reality simpler and even more manageable. Though various scholars do recognize the comparative method as a logical step, they differ in their opinions on its applicability, that is, whether it is scientific, statistical, experimental, or merely a basic method. While the interpretations vary on this factor, efforts are on to improve the use of these methods from time to time. With these words, I take your leave. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. Thank you so much.